Hey, this is Frank Honus, and I want to welcome you to the Pure Life Podcast, helping individuals live with sexual integrity through Jesus Christ. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 91 of the Pure Life Podcast. My name is Frank Honus, and I want to thank you guys so much for checking out the podcast this week. On the Pure Life Podcast, we talk about issues of sexual addiction like pornography addiction, masturbation, fantasy, lust, a lot of the tough subjects and issues that a lot of people would rather not even talk about. The church, in large part, is not talking about this issue. The world, obviously, our culture, totally accepts this issue and, sexualizes everything. And it's obviously not a problem or an issue to talk about there. So who's talking about this? Who's talking about the sexual struggles that many people feel on a weekly, a daily basis, a momentary basis? And so the Pure Life Podcast exists to help people who are struggling who have sexual struggles, who have pornography addiction and masturbation addiction, and we try to explore where all this stuff comes from. Not just, this is not a podcast that says, oh, you're bad, you're wrong for doing these things or feeling these things. Not at all. This is a shame-free podcast that talks about what all this stuff really is and what it means and the pain and the hurt that is underneath of all this stuff and how we can really find healing and what God, this is a Christ-centered podcast, so what we feel like, Jesus, how he really wants us to live as believers. And so that's what a little bit of an intro if this is your first time watching the podcast or listening to it. I do want to thank you. Hopefully you're listening on Stitcher and iTunes or the website and watching on YouTube. Really want to thank you guys for checking us out in that way. And hopefully you find all this through purelifepodcast.com. So this week I want to talk about a very, very, not a controversial kind of issue, but just a very foundational ground issue when it comes to sexual addiction, kind of a starter topic, if you will. And it's really this. It's about confronting sexual addictions in a healthy way. How can we confront, and I chose that word purposely, confront sexual addiction in a healthy way? How do we deal with it? Where do we begin? Where do we start? And I think it really starts with a mindset. I think it starts with a mindset. I think it starts with an understanding of how we deal with sexual addiction. Do we just manage it, or do we embrace it? Now, those two things might just kind of sound the same to you, managing your addiction and embracing your addiction, because you might say, well, I think we've got to do both. We can't allow the addiction to control us, so we have to be able to manage it in some way. And yes, you're right, but I want to suggest that those two words for the purpose of this week's podcast is two very different words whatsoever, or altogether. Confronting our sexual addictions, confronting pornography addiction, or whatever your addiction might be, but this being a podcast devoted to sexual purity. So, confronting sexual addiction in a healthy way, I want to suggest 3 ways this week on the podcast that we can better handle, better deal with, better confront pornography addiction, all the things that control our lives. And they're just 3 very kind of, like I said, philosophical, kind of foundational ways that really need to start in here, in our minds, and really need to start in our heart. And so number 1, managing your addiction, and I really kind of want you guys to see this as in 2 columns, if you will. Kind of think on the one side of the person that manages their addiction, meaning they're the micromanager. Every T's got to be crossed, every I's got to be dotted. Kind of very obsessed with almost a perfection mindset when it comes to addiction. And then I want you to see on the other column, I want you to see the word embrace. Embrace not being just acceptance, not being like, well, I don't care, I'm just going to embrace it and do whatever, but embracing almost being with the mindset of, if you embrace your addiction, it's almost as if you kind of are able to surf through your struggles a little bit. You're able to acknowledge that you have an addiction, but you're not so obsessed with every single little detail being perfect, because those of you who are listening to this podcast know that if you are addicted sexually in some way to something, that you're going to run into some serious bumps in the road, right? So number one, I want you to see this, that managing your addiction leaves very little room for mistakes and struggles. Embracing your addiction acknowledges that there will be bumps in the road and that sexual recovery takes time. So, I think about this in a way that I'm a kind of person that's a little bit OCD, and I've talked about this with my wife before, but I like everything to be kind of, I'm kind of like one of those guys. I like everything to kind of be straight and organized, and everything's got to be perfect. Everything's got to be detailed and filed away, and I kind of have a little bit of that obsessive, OCD kind of personality, and I tend to be a little bit on the managing side sometimes. I can really sometimes try to just, manage my, almost tempted to manage my addiction instead of embrace it for what it is. And sometimes what that means is us managers, if you're a manager, you tend to want to leave very little room for mistakes and struggles. The slightest little thing that goes wrong in your head, a random sexual thought that comes across, or a slip, a fall, you beat yourself up very easily, and you really get down on yourself. And so you leave a very little room, very little grace for those struggles and mistakes if you're a manager. If you're an embracer, if you're able to embrace your addiction, you acknowledge that there will be bumps in the road, there will be struggles, and that your sexual recovery will take time. And I also feel like I'm in this camp too, that I've embraced my addiction in a very, very major way. But understanding this, embracing your addiction, again, doesn't mean that you're just accepting it. It doesn't mean that you're saying it's okay. But you are realizing that you're in this for the long term. And you're realizing that sexual recovery takes time, that this is not a sprint, that it's a marathon. And I want you to kind of get this idea, not to be graphic or anyway, but an open wound, if you've ever cut yourself, or if you've ever scraped or anything or whatever, if you've had an open wound, that wound takes time to heal, right? It takes time for that wound to close up, for you to clean that wound, right? And for you to cover it with a bandage, and it takes time for that wound to close up. And then even when the wound is closing up, it's still very, very sensitive. It can if you don't keep it clean, it can become infected. But it takes time for that wound to heal. And even after that wound is healed, what's left? There's a scar, right? There's a scar that's left, marking that the wound was there. And so I don't think necessarily those scars are bad to have, but the wound takes time to heal. And in the same way, sexual addiction, especially for the person who's uncovering a lot of stuff in their life, is uncovering a lot of pain, uncovering a lot of hurt, it takes time for them to heal. Right? So number one, that's the difference there. Managing means you leave very little room for mistakes, little room for struggles, but embracing means you acknowledge that this is going to take time for me to heal. It's going to take time for me to recover. Okay? Number two, managing your addiction relies on your own strength to grow, which is what I like to call and have come to know as white knuckle change. Embracing your addiction relies on God's strength to grow. And this is what I've come to know as real change. All right. So again, if you're a micromanager, which I tend to be sometimes, is you rely on your own efforts, on your own strength, on your own abilities to grow. And again, it's that managing kind of mentality. Whether you don't really lean into God for your struggles. You tend to, maybe you set up the software on your computer, or you set up different boundaries in your life, different systems in your life, but you still don't necessarily feel that change inside and that healing and that growing internally. And that's because you are just simply, you're kind of managing your addiction. You're not really embracing it. And so that's white knuckle change. That's kind of gripping it, doing it by your own will. But again, embracing your addiction relies on not just your strength and not your strength alone, but God's strength to grow and to heal. And again, I've been able to be on this side as well, and it's a whole lot better than the white knuckle change, real change, leaning into God, knowing that God has been the one to deliver me from my sexual sin and my sexual addiction in life, that all the credit goes to Him. That the last 5 years of my life have been the best years of my life since coming out of the darkness into the light from pornography addiction. It's just been amazing. And so that is real change, that we've got to run to God. We've got to trust God with our sexual struggles. We've got to trust God with our addiction. And maybe you haven't reached that point yet, and I want to encourage you to go there. If you don't have a relationship with Christ, is to really think about that. You cannot, and I've said this time and time again, you cannot beat this addiction on your own. You just won't be able to do it. You might be able to manage it for a while. You may be able to stop watching porn for a few months, but eventually you will go back to it if you do not lean into God and you do not surrender this to Jesus first and allow God to be the one that brings healing in your life. And so, again, managing versus embracing. And then the last one I want to talk about, managing your addiction expects instantaneous growth and results, almost a drive-through mentality. But embracing your addiction sets realistic, attainable growth goals throughout for each day. Okay, and so again, let's break that down a little bit. Micromanagers, we tend to want that growth instantaneously, and this is not McDonald's. This is not a McDonald's kind of thing. Addiction is definitely not like McDonald's. It's not like you go right through the drive-through and in a day or a week or a month, you're over your addiction. You can't just sweep this thing under the rug and expect for it to be instantly gone. And that's sometimes what managing your addiction, sometimes we fall into this slump and this kind of like this disappointment of like, man, why am I not further, or why am I not, farther along in my recovery? And I want to kind of pose to you and suggest that maybe you're not really embracing it, you're just managing it. Okay, you're trying to maybe your expectations in some ways are unrealistic, because embracing your addiction means that you're going to set these realistic, attainable goals for each day. You're going to say, all right, you know what? I just looked at porn yesterday. I'm going to make a goal to not look at porn for a week or even 3 or 4 days, right? I masturbated 2 days ago. I'm going to make a goal to not masturbate for the next 3 days. You set these goals for you. Don't say, okay, you know what? I just acted out, and I'm not going to do it again for another year. Or another 6 months, or, not that those are bad things, and I'm not discouraging you from setting goals, but let's set manageable, attainable, realistic goals for your recovery, all right? And embracing, because you gotta realize that there will be bumps in the road, there will be slips, there will be setbacks, there will be disappointments, there will be mistakes. And so what I'm trying to set you guys up for is just realizing that this is a long-term battle. Okay, this is a long-term process, not a short-term battle. Okay, this is not something we just win or lose overnight, because there will be several battles that we have to face and that we'll have to take on and engage in. So that's a few things about confronting sexual addictions in a healthy way. Those are a few healthy ways that we can confront pornography addiction, masturbation, fantasy, whatever your sexual addiction might be, or sexual struggle might be. I want to encourage you to rewind this, to go back maybe, and to listen to this again, and really try to decide, do I manage or do I embrace? What kind of mindset do I have as far as my recovery goes, as far as my sexual addiction goes? Hope that's encouraging to you this week for the Pure Life Podcast. Again, I thank you for listening and watching to episode 91. And just listen, if you need to reach out to me in any way, please do that. You can go to purelifepodcast.com. You can tweet me, Facebook, email me there, and I would love to chat with you, would love to connect with you in any way, encourage you in any way possible. Thank you guys again so much for listening, and until next week, I wish you a pure life. God bless. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to the podcast this week. I want to encourage you to check out our website, purelifepodcast.com, for a lot of great blogs and resources and podcasts from previous episodes to help you along in your journey for sexual purity. Remember, you can listen to the podcast on our website, iTunes, and Stitcher Radio. And if you need to contact me for any reason, if you have questions or comments, email me at frank@purelifepodcast.com. That's frank@purelifepodcast.com. See you next week.